Hello and welcome to the new study that I'm doing on becoming God's people. The idea for this study is that I reflect on passages every week that our text for the week, send out a reflection on that. And the idea hit me to go through from Genesis to the end of Deuteronomy this year in 2023, starting Genesis 1, ending in the last chapters of Deuteronomy, and outline what it meant for Israel to become God's people and what it means to be God's people. I thought that I could do that relatively easily, but there is some difficulty in it. Number one, there's 50 weeks or 50 chapters in Genesis and 52 weeks in the year, so you can already see that we have to cut out a significant portion of those 5 books. There is a long and detailed narrative that's being wrapped up in these books, and it's more than simply random strands of information. They are trying to tell a tale. They're trying to give a narrative of what's going on in the world and who God's people are meant to be and what they are meant to do. So my idea is that I'm going to start a video series that gives kind of background to the text that I'm working on in the week, covers maybe some of the skipped over chapters, keeps the narrative a little more cohesive without bogging down all the other things that we do. I try to keep my reflection in the text of the week to just that, the reflection on that specific text, but that means that there's a lot cut out and there's a lot that I don't get to talk about or put in. And so these videos are going to be a chance for me to talk about them. Typically that the notes that I create are released on Fridays. And so these videos, I'm planning on releasing them on Friday right around noon. And the goal will be to have a link to the text in the video. So that if you are working through all of this, there's a place you can go to read the reflection after I kind of set it up. So with that in mind, this week's text, because it is the first week of January, well, it makes sense to start in the beginning, to start with Genesis 1. And so I will be reflecting on the creation of humanity that begins in Genesis 1:26 and reflecting on that story and what it means within the narrative. But that also means that there's some background that needs to happen. Like, what is the creation account? What is this story in Genesis 1 all about? And I love the way that it begins. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashmayim va et haaretz. The just wonderful 7 words long that captures this story in a nutshell. And it's traditionally been translated, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And this follows closely the translation from Hebrew into Latin. And that in turn follows closely the translation from Hebrew into Greek. But it misses some things because we as modern Americans hear the words "in the beginning" and we think of something other than what the Hebrew author would have thought. We think about a scientific understanding of "in the beginning." We think about what we would call cosmology in physics, the idea of where did the universe begin, its physical beginnings. And that isn't really what the Hebrew author is trying to get at. For one thing, it doesn't really say "in the beginning." It says more literally, "at the time that God began. It is not a definite beginning moment. It is the phrase means when God began. Now, some more modern translations are starting to adapt that and to put that language into their text, usually with a footnote that says "or in the beginning." But really, what the beginning is the beginning of God's creation, God's work. Not the beginning of the cosmos, the way we would think of it. Not the beginning of the universe. This is the beginning of God's work. And what is God's work? Well, traditionally we say to create. But when you and I think of creation, we typically think of to physically make something. And in our minds, because of the text, we think of physically creating from nothing. Because in our minds, there's nothing before the universe, and this is talking about the creation of the universe, so the physical making of the universe out of nothing. That's typically where we go with this story, and that's a lot of where people want to take this. But Hebrew scholars have done a really great job in pointing out that the word that is there, bara, doesn't really mean to physically make something. It means to give it purpose. So what we see here is not necessarily the physical creation of the universe. What we are talking about in Genesis 1, what the Hebrew author is talking about, is God giving purpose to creation. What the Hebrew author wants us to see is not this is how atoms formed into molecules and those molecules formed into stars and stars, became the building blocks of creation. What the Hebrew author wants us to see is God is giving purpose to everything. And that is modeled in the days of creation. Day 1, light and dark are created. Now, from a physics perspective and in our reality, we understand that there is no light in the universe apart from stars. There isn't. There's just no light in the universe coming onto this planet that is not created from a star. Well, at least in the popular imagination, there's probably something in the world, in the larger cosmos that I'm not thinking about right now. But the truth is, light and dark don't exist as their own entities. But in the biblical story, the author sets them up as entities on their own. On day 2, the sky is created to divide the water from the water. On day 3, dry land, plants, trees, those kinds of things are created. Now, those parallel perfectly days 4, 5, and 6. Days 1, 2, and 3 create space for the entities created in days 4, 5, and 6 that have agency. The entities created in days 4, 5, and 6 have agency over or within the space created on days 1, 2, and 3. The entities on day 4, the sun, moon, and stars, have agency within the creation of the larger, what we would call outer space, this larger dome in the biblical imagination, where light and dark inhabit. We have these entities given the reign and rule over the space of light and dark to illuminate and keep time in our day. So we see their need is to fill the space created on day 1, just like the birds and the fish and sea monsters on day 4 or day 5 fill the space created by the sky and the waters on day 2. They fill that space. They occupy and govern that space. On day 6, we see created land animals and people, and they fill the dry land. They fill that space. And this is meant to show us a pattern of purpose given in creation, not a picture of the physical order of creation. This is not meant to show us that God created in this pattern. It is telling us that God created the universe to bring order, a specific order to the universe. And we know that. I mean, we are taught by other passages that God is orderly. God has purpose. God is not haphazard. And what do we see if we try to say that Genesis 1 is a scientific account? A haphazard, disordered God. A God who creates light and then changes all of physics so that light comes from the sun and not just exists on its own. We see a haphazard God who creates water and plants and all these other things. Well, God doesn't even create water in the Genesis account. God separates the waters and gives them purpose, but God doesn't create water. All of this is disordered and haphazard if we try to read it scientifically, because, well, we know plants cannot grow without the sun. In other words, God is, if we read the Genesis account as merely just, this is the order in which God created things, we are again and again presented with this problem that God is forever changing the way that the universe fundamentally works in order to shoehorn something new into it. And that to me is just a really bad conception of God, who in so many ways wants to bring order into our lives where there is chaos. And Genesis 1 is showing us that. God is giving purpose to the things that are there in order to make something brand new. And what is it that God is making? Well, God is creating a temple. If you look at the language that God is using or the Genesis is using of God in Genesis 1, and you compare it with temple dedications, this is very similar to the language of a temple being dedicated. God is making all of creation into one giant temple. And that is the story behind Genesis 1, that all of the cosmos is a temple meant to worship God. Everything has its purpose and its place in order to worship God. And this is, if we look into the Psalms, think of Psalm 8, what is humanity that you are mindful of them? Or Psalm 19, the heavens declare God's glory. These are psalms that show a temple, not necessarily the way we visualize, say, Psalm 19, that the heavens, the stars in the sky are meant to point humanity to God. That's not what the psalmist is necessarily talking about. It's not that the heavens declare to you and I God's glory. The heavens are reflecting their purpose in worship. The stars in the sky are reflective of their purpose as part of God's temple and are actually glorifying God. They are declaring God's glory to God by being part of the properly functioning temple. That is what humanity is brought into in this chapter. The plants, the animals, the stars, everything down to the sea monsters is meant to worship God in God's temple. And that is where humanity, the creation of humanity, picks up, and that's where my reflection for the week picks up, is what does it mean for humanity to be part of this temple scenario? And within the context of Genesis 1, humanity is the image of God. Another word for, and kind of a dirty word in Christian circles for image, is idol. It's actually the exact same word. we are the idol of God. That is, in a pagan temple, the idol was the last thing put in, and then a ceremony of opening the idol's eyes and ears and mouth was performed, and then the idol became the piece of the temple that conveyed God's message to the world around, or the God's message to the world around the temple. And guess what? That's the role that humanity is given in Genesis 1. We are given this role of being part of the temple and overseeing the temple and the worship, and acting as God's hands and feet and mouthpiece and eyes and ears and all of that. So that is where humanity was meant to begin. Humanity was meant to begin as the image of God in this world, functioning with God for the completion of the temple that God is creating. And that's kind of some background on Genesis 1. I hope that you enjoyed this. Let me know where I can improve on all of this. If you have any questions or comments, please drop them to me. I'd love to be able to reflect more on this, especially Genesis 1. I love Genesis 1. It's one of my favorite chapters in all of the Bible. Also, I'd love to be able to improve this series as it goes on through the year. Let me know how helpful it is or not helpful. And until we meet again, God bless.